So I want to thank everybody for coming to this event. This is part of the Latino and Puerto Rican Studies program, which is a minor here at CCSU. And we wanted to have this event to show everybody kind of the different ways that you can come at Latino studies from all the different disciplines at CCSU. We have some flyers around the room that include one about the initiative with Puerto Rico that CCSU is having, the AID initiative through the Ana Grace Project. We have information about the Puerto Rican Studies minor, including courses that you can sign up for next semester that count under the minor. So please take a look at those and help yourself to the refreshments. I want to welcome Dr. Lorrin Thomas from Rutgers University at Camden. Yeah, I haven't. Oh, okay. Dr. Thomas's research explores ideas about rights and equality in the 20th century Americas. Her award-winning first book, Puerto Rican Citizen, History and Political Identity in the 20th Century, traces the complex meanings of citizenship for Puerto Ricans in the United States. Professor Thomas teaches a range of courses on Latin American history and the history of the Americas, including survey courses on Latin America and the Caribbean, U.S. and Latin American relations, and race and ethnicity in the Americas, and new research about human rights and Puerto Ricans in the 1970s is something that she's looking more into. So today she's going to give us a good overview of the history of Puerto Rico and a little bit of insight into its how we got here pre-Maria, and then following her talk we have an interdisciplinary panel of CCSU faculty who will kind of help us work through what Puerto Rico's future might be. So I want, again, to thank everybody for coming, and I'll turn it over to you, and I will turn on the... Okay.
Hello. It might take a second. Let me make sure. Is my voice clear enough?
I'll keep working on that.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here, and thanks to Professor Glazer in the History Department for inviting me to CCSU and to the Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Center here for co-sponsoring the talk. I'm going to just do my preliminaries while we figure out the
So that's showing now.
Oh, it is? Yeah. Oh, okay, good. We're all set. I can't see it, so I just want to make sure. I'd also like to thank the Organization of American Historians, which sponsored my visit today through their Distinguished Lecturer program. This helps the organization in its mission to promote excellence in the scholarship, teaching, and presentation of American history. So I appreciate this opportunity to share with you some of the work that I've done on the history of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans in the United States, and particularly at this moment. I think we all know why this is so important. So my goal today is to provide you with the historical context required to understand this difficult and confusing situation that Puerto Rico finds itself in 2017. Okay, it's like just when I shift the slides, I just want to make sure that the first ones go okay. So this is exactly 100 years since the residents of Puerto Rico, there we go, were made citizens of the United States by an act of Congress. More on that in a moment, the act of Congress. Perhaps some of you have actually heard the recent statistic circulated this fall that 54% of Americans know that Puerto Ricans are American citizens. Any of you heard that? Yeah. Well, I think I'm not being sarcastic here. I think that's an optimistic estimate. I've read that the sample size was like about 2,000 people, and I sense it's not really representative. I haven't scrutinized the study. I don't want to malign the study, but I was wondering if maybe that 54% was the percentage of people in Congress that know Puerto Ricans are American citizens, and I'm not really being all that sarcastic about that. So for Puerto Ricans both in the US and on the island, there's a bitter irony, especially at this particular moment, in analyzing the role that American citizenship has played in their history throughout the last century. At least right now, this irony is becoming a little bit more visible to anybody who's paying attention. So that's a small silver lining in what is a really just difficult, tragic, and infuriating political situation that we're in. After the United States federal government's response to Puerto Rico's crises in recent months, it's all the more obvious that we can't talk about Puerto Rico's experiences of its relationship with the US without addressing their status as colonial citizens. So that's one of the kind of arguments that will be threaded through this presentation today. So I'm going to begin now by focusing on some present-day issues surrounding Puerto Rico's political status vis-a-vis the US. Then I'll review some key aspects of the island's relationship with the US during the past century, exploring the foundations, some of them racist, that underlay policy and interpretations of the law. Then in my conclusion, I'll come back to the immediate present and the crisis the island faces now. So let's start with what Puerto Ricans have long called the status issue. On 5 occasions in the past 50 years, Puerto Ricans on the island have answered ballot questions. These are sometimes referred to as plebiscites or referenda, to express their preferences on the issue of the island's political status, with choices ranging from US statehood, full independence, those are the opposite ends of the spectrum, or one of a variety of possibilities in between. This gray area in between is the category into which the current Commonwealth or associated free state falls. The most recent such ballot initiative took place in 2017, in June actually. But because it was boycotted by one of the island's 2 largest political parties, the PPD, this ballot only produced a 23% turnout, meaning only 23% of eligible voters voted, which is the lowest turnout of any such ballot initiative in the past 50 years. It's also roughly the inverse of the turnout for the 2012 plebiscite, which got more attention than this most recent one. I'm going to say a bit more about it. It got more attention because it produced what was perceived to be a surprising outcome, but I will say that even though it was considered to be an important set of findings in terms of Puerto Ricans' preferences about their status, the New York Times did not report on it for about 10 days, and there was no actual reporting on the ballot question. There was just kind of an opinion piece that followed maybe a week after the vote. I found that kind of surprising. So this referendum in 2012 was declared to be a decisive expression of a majority preference for statehood for the island for the first time ever. So it got a good bit of attention on the island for that reason, but this conclusion was actually pretty problematic. This conclusion about the strong preference for statehood was problematic and probably inaccurate. The vote was divided into 2 parts. There were 2 questions. The first question asked, do you approve or disapprove of the status quo, meaning the status that the island currently occupies, which is this in-between Commonwealth, or in Spanish, it's Estado Libre Asociado, associated free state, has some independence in its governance, but a lot of dependence on the United States. So the first question, a majority of people said no, they do not approve, but only a slight majority, as you can see here. The second question produced a larger preference, expressed preference for statehood, but only, only 70% of the people who filled out the ballot question answered the second question. So to say that 61% of Puerto Ricans voted for statehood is actually inaccurate. I don't think you need to be too much of a sophisticated analyst of statistics to see that. So there was, at the time, much debate about how to read those results, especially because of the alleged abstention by many voters who supported the Commonwealth status. And in fact, through all 5 of these ballot questions in the past 50 years, most nationalists, those who support outright independence, have not voted at all. Or that's kind of the party line, and there is, the Nationalist Party tends to boycott these votes. So it does not represent, I would argue, the full range of what the Puerto Rican population thinks about the status question. I'd argue that it would be accurate to say that a majority of Puerto Ricans voted against the colonial status quo, and that at least a plurality, meaning the largest group of the subsections of preference, voted in favor of U.S. statehood as a solution to the island's problematic relationship to the United States. In other words, a rejection of colonialism. But the problem lies, or well, one of the clearest problems, lies in what follows that conclusion. Even if there were agreement about the majority position of Puerto Rican voters, the path forward is anything but clear because it depends on the United States Congress to take action on that stated preference. The current political status of the island cannot change without decisive action, without a vote, an act of Congress in the United States Congress. So first, they have to care enough to take that up. Another immediate problem is that despite all the emphasis on the Latino vote in the last couple of decades, especially during presidential elections, I'm sure you're all aware of this to some degree, national political leaders have paid very little attention to the Puerto Rican electorate on the mainland. The number of Puerto Rican voters in the US is relatively small, only about 10% of the total number of voters counted as Latinos in the US. Compare that to about 50% of the Latino vote is considered to be Mexican American. But, and increasingly, Puerto Ricans are spreading out from their usual concentration in the urban Northeast, in the New York metro area, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, where their largely Democratic votes blend into a sea of blue. So politicians have typically paid pretty scant attention to Puerto Rican voters because their votes are not going to swing any elections in any particular direction. But the Puerto Rican electorate has been growing rapidly in southern states like North Carolina and especially Florida. In fact, if migration rates continue along their current trend, and this is especially true after the tragedy of the hurricane and the migration boom that is sure to follow, Puerto Ricans residing in Florida will outnumber the state's Republican stronghold of Cuban Americans by the next presidential election. And Florida may no longer be up for grabs. It might not be. It's been called sort of a purple state in the last couple of presidential elections. Puerto Rican voters are likely to hand, I thought I had a slide on that, I don't, are likely to hand the state to the Democrats. So the preferences, the concerns of Puerto Rican voters in the US, even though they don't vote in the plebiscites on the status question on the island, there is likely to be increasing attention on the part of US lawmakers about what Puerto Rican voters, especially in these key states, Florida most significant among them, what those voters care about, what they're concerned about. Yet even as that calculus of voters changes rapidly in these years, the status of Puerto Rico remains a political hot potato for Congress for a different reason. If Puerto Rico became the 51st state of the United States, it would be able to elect between 4 and 6 representatives to Congress, and of course 2 senators. Every state gets 2 senators, and would control up to 8 electoral college votes. Now, you all know from watching last year's contentious election how important electoral college votes can be. And if Puerto Ricans on the island follow their likely patterns when they vote in primary elections, because they do get to vote in presidential primaries, they don't vote in the actual election of the federal election for president. We can talk about that on the panel a bit if you want. It's a little confusing, but there's a certain logic to it. Puerto Ricans, both on the island and on the mainland, tend to vote Democratic. It is unlikely that the current Congress would never be interested in this question of Puerto Rican statehood. But even in a less Republican-controlled Congress, the difficulties of throwing off what has long been a balance of the 50 states we do have and the electoral college votes we do have, it seems very unlikely to me that Congress would be willing to take on this question. So this is all by way of saying that the ballot questions on the island are important, but they leave open a question that I think is unlikely to be answered by our Congress. So we can also talk about that. So yes, I'm painting a pretty pessimistic view of the possibilities for change in any direction. I'm not advocating any particular one. I have my own points of view, but the possibilities for change seem constrained. But because I'm a historian, I get to shift the conversation. I get to say, well, I can't answer, the future. I can't sort of offer likely outcomes, but I can shift the conversation to focus on the past, and I can help us answer some questions about why it is that so few people, aside from Puerto Ricans, both in the US and on the island, have paid any attention until now to the questions of political status, citizenship, and law that govern the US-Puerto Rico relationship. So that's what I'm going to shift my attention to now, to this lack of knowledge of the history of the island and its colonial ties to the US, which leads to a presumption of the insignificance of Puerto Rico in US affairs, and to the insignificance of Puerto Ricans on the mainland as political actors in the United States. So I hope to convince you otherwise on those 2 points. I call this imperial arrogance, and I think it's best if we all avoid that. So I want to talk first about the origins of this colonial relationship. Some of you may be aware that Puerto Rico became a territory controlled by the United States following the War of 1898, which is usually inaccurately described as the Spanish-American War. In fact, it was a war that was started by Cuban and Puerto Rican independence fighters with Spain. They were the last 2 colonies Spain had in the Americas. And in the 1860s, Spanish and Cuban independence fighters went to war with Spain, fought for 10 years, lost that war. Many of them were exiled, regrouped in Mexico and the United States, in Florida, and then started another round of war with Spain to fight for their independence in 1895. The United States got involved in that war in 1898, pretty handily defeated Spain, and then we renamed the war after us. So I thought you should know that. The Puerto Rican independence fighters, along with their Spanish their Cuban fellow independence fighters, they greeted U.S. intervention with a certain hope, a vague hope, that the U.S. would support Puerto Ricans in their aspirations for sovereignty. This did not happen. The U.S. supported with some caveats independence for Cuba, and then decided to retain control over Puerto Rico. It was strategically useful. It promised some commercial benefits, controlling sugarcane industry and other business opportunities and connections with Latin American markets. So starting immediately, pretty much in 1898, the U.S. got into, or lawmakers and politicians in the U.S. engaged in debates about what to call the relationship between our country and this island. Remember, we had fought a war for independence for ourselves. We wrote the first democratic, well, the now longest lasting democratic constitution in the world. We believed ourselves to be upholders of other people's sovereignty, independence, and democratic rights. So it was a bit of a problem to arrange the language around this relationship that we had developed with an island that lawmakers pretty clearly decided was not going to become a state of the United States. And they decided it as they were debating the status question back in the early 20th century. They were also debating the question of citizenship. Must the US Constitution follow the flag? If our flag was holding the island of Puerto Rico as part of our country, were we obligated to ensure the same rights to the people on that island as we offered to our own citizens? There were arguments on both sides, and most of them were openly racist in one form or another. The debate about whether to include the people of Puerto Rico in the United States as citizens generally turned on questions of racial the racial imaginary of the United States. The lawmakers perceived the United States to be a white country, led and ruled by white people, and they were not interested in opening up US citizenship to people who did not fit that vision. So you see that on both sides, those who argued that the Constitution should follow the flag and the people of Puerto Rico should be US citizens were not able to fully sidestep arguments based on race. Those who opposed extending citizenship to Puerto Ricans were even more open about their objections to incorporating the alien races, et cetera, as Senator Depew said. So even in 1917, which was right before the United States passed the legislation, the Jones Act, that extended citizenship to Puerto Ricans on the island, even at that moment, the debate on the floors of Congress, and this is recorded in the congressional record. This is like, nobody was trying to not be heard saying these things. Yes, it was 100 years ago, but this was the discourse that was considered normal public discourse on questions of citizenship and inclusion in our country. So the questions about self-government were tied to presumptions about incapacity rooted in racial heritage. This was liberal democracy in the new US empire. Now, just one clarification, a quick clarification. Some of you may have heard some discussion since the hurricane about the Jones Act. There are two Jones Acts. The one I'm talking about is called the Jones-Shayforth Act 1917. This is the one that restructured the island's government. It established a legislature for the island structured much like that of the United States legislature at Congress. And it extended citizenship to islanders. There was another Jones Act passed in 1920, a totally different piece of legislation by a totally different legislator named Jones. That was just a coincidence. That was the one that related to shipping, and it constricted the ability of Puerto Rico to receive any goods from ships that were not built, owned, and operated by American shipping companies. So this was a problem after the hurricane because the island couldn't get relief from foreign countries that was being offered. That law had to be suspended, that 20-year-old law, which John McCain actually, for various free market reasons in the 1990s, spent a lot of time trying to suspend, just totally separate from the hurricane thing. But I just thought that would be a useful bit of knowledge. So I want to say a few things now about Puerto Ricans who came to the US, how their status as full citizens on the mainland, did it really mean that they were being governed with representation? Because the citizenship offered to Puerto Ricans on the island, I would argue, was governance without representation. They had a non-voting representative in Congress established as part of the Jones Act in 1917. That is still true today. The resident commissioner is the representative from the island, one person, goes to the US Congress, can listen to all the debates they want, can participate in some committee votes, but cannot vote on final pieces of legislation. So therefore, the resident commissioner of the island cannot advocate for the interests of Puerto Ricans, even though they're citizens of the United States. I call this governance without representation. So those who came to the US after 1917 were citizens in all the same ways that their American neighbors, North American neighbors, were citizens. That was technically true. They could vote in all local, state, and national elections. But they struggled, of course, to be equal citizens, to use their citizenship to elect representatives. This was true in the 1920s. It was true all the way up through. It really only started to change in New York City in the 1970s. It didn't change in Connecticut, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Chicago. Those are all places that had large Puerto Rican populations by the 1960s. There were hardly any Puerto Ricans elected to represent Puerto Rican communities in those places until the 1980s. Just an aside. So Puerto Ricans' visibility in the United States as voters has been perceived as a threat by many white Americans for the past 100 years. I'll just share with you this interesting question posed by the chair of the Committee on Immigration and Naturalization in 1931. This is a Republican representative from Ohio who's raising the alarm to his fellow members of Congress who did not know that Puerto Ricans were citizens. I mean, yes, it had only been 15 years or something like that, but still, he's saying, how many of you, and he's speaking to his colleagues in Congress, how many of you know, especially you people in New York where this colony, he said, Colonial, is growing, they might decide to elect their own representatives. Beware. The early 30s was, of course, an era of major economic depression, which intensified the tendencies toward exclusion. It intensified racist discourse of all kinds against African Americans, but included also Puerto Ricans. There was a sort of generalized anxiety about race relations that deeply affected the growing Puerto Rican migrant communities, which were centered mostly in New York at this time. And so in this context, the meaning of citizenship became both more important and more contentious for New York's Puerto Ricans. And the racial dimensions of that citizenship were increasingly important. During the Depression, Puerto Ricans were effectively categorized as black, or at least as ineligible for the privileges of white citizenship. There's a kind of implicit assumption that real citizenship is the citizenship that white people had. Lynching was still a huge problem among African Americans in the 1920s. In fact, it peaked in the 1920s. So in the 1930s, this was not to be categorized as black, which was what many advocates who were noticing and becoming alarmed about this growing population, this is what they were advocating. And it was a way of controlling this population and limiting its power. So I want to show you, just by chance, in the same year as that warning from the representative in Congress, a couple of examples of identification cards that Puerto Rican migrants applied for in New York City. They came without passports. There was no passport office on the island. When Puerto Ricans were competing for jobs during the Depression, a lot of employers said, oh, you're a foreigner, I'm not going to hire you. And they complained to their government, their home government, and said, we need proof that we are American citizens. We don't want to be treated like, well, they were just trying to get a leg up in a really challenging job market and try to gain some of the benefits of their American citizenship. So what I found when I looked through a sample, several hundred of these ID card applications from the 1930s, is that when people applied for the ID card, they had to fill out they had to describe their own complexion. And then they were issued a card, and the card included, along with some other physical characteristics like height and eye color and occupation, well, occupation is not a physical characteristic, but along with several other details, the ID card listed complexion. So the applicant filled in the complexion blank, but what I found on these application cards is that anyone who wrote white, and often light, was scratched out. 100% of the application cards that I found where an applicant tried to say, well, I'm white, that was corrected by the person processing the application. Now, this is actually a bit of a complicated conversation that I'm not going to say too much about, because the employees of the identification office, operated by the government of Puerto Rico and operated in New York City by the government of Puerto Rico, the employees were Puerto Rican themselves. So there was a bit of a kind of a class and power dynamic. I surmise, I could find no documentation to really flesh this out, but it's an interesting illustration of the complexities that Puerto Ricans encountered when they were new migrants in the United States, American citizens being pushed in multiple directions, and certainly shown how limited their power as American citizens would be. Here's another example. So, what's that? Yeah, so some people came with birth certificates, and this person's birth certificate happened to say his mother was of the white race, irrelevant in the correction that appeared on his application card. So the challenges of the Depression for Puerto Rican migrants in the 30s gave way to a new kind of scrutiny during World War II. The real enormous migration from the island began after World War II, but there was a steadily increasing migration during the war. And here is an example of the kind of reception. Oh, the top got cut off. This is a sort of a excerpt from an article in a magazine called Scribner's Commentator in 1940. This was like a conservative, isolationist magazine published actually in collaboration with Scribner's and Sons, the publishers. And this article warned its readers of the dangers of this growing migration of Puerto Ricans. That's okay, you can, it's just a tiny bit that got cut off at the top. And the writer of this article called what he presented a statistical history based on what he identified as this theoretical group. If there were 10 Puerto Rican refugees, that's how he described them, then they would fall into these categories based on that number of 10. All of them would be on relief. That's welfare. That's what welfare was called in the 30s and 40s, in the minimum period, et cetera, et cetera. So in some ways, this was kind of classic anti-immigrant discourse. I mean, the Italians, the Irish, Eastern Europeans, Jews, Russians in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and had encountered similar kinds of alarms and hostility framed around their dangerousness. They were sick, they were poor, they had low morals, they had no education, they had no desire to be American or act like Americans. So it's kind of classic in that sense. But it's also got this kind of modern, it sort of it kind of gives us a preview of some of the language of drug addiction, prostitution, that would become part of the really aggressive descriptions of Puerto Rican migrants in the 1940s and 50s. I'm not going to say too much about that. I just wanted to give you a sense of what this looked like at mid-century. I'm going to shift back to the status question. I pointed out earlier in my talk that the questions of political status were issues that US lawmakers like to avoid. In fact, they still do. There is only one US congressional representative, and he was in Congress between the 1930s and 1950s, only one who openly acknowledged the colonial relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico. That was Vito Marcantonio. He represented the East Harlem district in New York. He was in the National Congress. He was his district was East Harlem. And he had an amazing ability to respond to both his Italian-American constituents who lived there and who were being quickly outnumbered in the 1950s by Puerto Ricans, whom he embraced and whose political concerns became his concerns in Congress. The only other politician that I'm aware of from the mid-20th century, before the late 1960s really, who was willing to call the relationship between the US and Puerto Rico colonial, was actually an FDR appointee, Rexford Tugwell. He was governor of the island during World War II. And in a memoir that he wrote shortly after his term, in fact, I think he must have been writing it while he was governor, because he published it the year after he finished, and title was The Stricken Land. It was a kind of a summary of the United States governance of the island, and it was highly critical of, it was quite critical of the United States. And here's what I think is a great summation of that criticism. We had interests of which we could not let go. This was at a time when Puerto Ricans were trying to take advantage of a new spirit of democracy and a kind of support for sovereignty around the world. We had just fought World War II. We had just pushed the Germans out of Europe and stood up for democracy all over the world. And a lot of independence-oriented Puerto Ricans, both on the island and in the US, thought this was a great moment to remind Congress of its ideological commitments and to make good on its promises. It didn't work very well. And Rexford Tugwell is one of the only representative or of the only government official I'm aware of besides Marcantonio who is willing to say that. Oops, I don't want to get there yet. After these efforts to get the U.S. to kind of ride the wave of World War II freedom and democracy and extend that to Puerto Rico. After that seemed destined to fail, the United Nations had recently been created, and at this point, advocates of the self-determination of Puerto Rico began lobbying the United Nations. Starting in 1953, they argued that Puerto Rico should be included on a list maintained of colonized nations, non-self-governing territories. There's not a lot of concrete significance to this. There's a real important symbolic significance. The United States did not want to be included on a list of countries that held other nations hostage, essentially, against their will. And so the US fought back, and they managed to keep Puerto Rico off that list, in part by changing the island's status in 1952. This is when the unincorporated territory of Puerto Rico, with this kind of haphazard set of laws to define its relationship to the US, this is when it became a Commonwealth in 1952. There was continued objection to this on the part of people who were pushing for Puerto Rican sovereignty. And the first referendum, the first vote on the island's status, was held a good bit later in 1967. This was an era of increasing decolonization all around the world. Former colonies in Africa, in Southeast Asia, were throwing off the yoke of colonialism, successfully starting independent nations. So Puerto Rico was, again, the people who were pushing for sovereignty and independence, again, were trying to connect their case to this larger discourse that, in the abstract, the United States always supported. So the plebiscite in 1967 was interesting. The nationalists boycotted it. They called these colonial elections. They called the Commonwealth status that had happened 15 years before a perfumed colonialism, and said that they would not participate. So a bunch of nationalists, along with a rising group of activist youth in New York City, protested the plebiscite in 1967. They took out a 2-page ad in the New York Times accusing the US of staging the plebiscite to, quote, avoid a United Nations inquiry on this case of Puerto Rico. Votes for the Commonwealth in this plebiscite in 67 won out at 60%. Statehood got almost 39%, and independence 2%. In the same year, there was a major riot in New York City's largest Puerto Rican neighborhood, East Harlem. So now I'm going to bring things back to kind of the domestic community politics of citizenship and show you how some of these connections were being made in the streets. So a writer who became famous, Piri Thomas, maybe some of you have heard of him. He wrote a memoir published in 67, just before the riot in East Harlem happened in the summer of 67. He was then called on by an advisory commission on civil disorders that was convened. There had been riots happening throughout the 60s in a lot of major cities, a number of them in Connecticut from the mid-60s on, all over the Northeast, in Los Angeles, in many cities. And Piri Thomas, in his testimony, focused on this kind of constriction. It's personal, but he's also talking about the refusal of belonging that, according to him, Puerto Ricans still experience. Yes, they're American citizens. No, they do not belong. They're poor. That complicates a sense of belonging. It complicates a sense of possibility and sort of freedom to change one's circumstances. But he was very much connecting this individual experience of kind of crushing poverty and lack of opportunity with the political constriction of the status of Puerto Ricans. At the same time, Puerto Rican and African American students were organizing new left-wing community groups, challenging the status quo, combining radical neighborhood politics with the radical politics of independence. The Young Lords is the most famous of these. There were many others. A lot of them collaborated in many cities, not just New York City. The Young Lords actually had a chapter in Hartford. They had chapters in Camden, Philadelphia. They actually started in Chicago. So organizations like this were bringing together this sense of challenging the sense of denied belonging that Perry Thomas talked about and attaching it to demands for self-determination. Self-determination on the streets, in the schools, in the universities, and in places like Puerto Rico that were still not given the chance to be sovereign and self-determining. Oops, I lost, oh, there we go. Here's a picture from a strike, a student strike in 1969. This was one of a string of campus actions. The CUNY strike and many others around this time were geared toward establishing Black Studies, Third World Studies, Puerto Rican Studies, Chicano Studies departments. There was, as you all are surely aware, campus activism on a lot of issues around the same time, and there was a lot of intersection among these groups. But at CUNY in New York, there was this kind of particularly strong movement to shut down the university and demand greater access to college from poor neighborhoods, kids from poor neighborhoods, and also the establishment of academic departments where there would be scholars and teaching that focused on the concerns of these students. So this was actually a really important outcome of the campus activism in the late 60s, early 70s, was the development of Puerto Rican studies programs. This was part of a national trend, as I had mentioned, and it really changed, it's time to wind down. It really changed kind of the sense of opportunity and self-determination, just as the Young Lords explained in their platform. I'm gonna, transition to closing by showing you, this is sort of a little bit later in the expansion of scholarship on Puerto Rican history and law. Jose Cabranes, who is now a judge, a retired judge, I believe, became a towering legal figure. In fact, he was a mentor to Sonia Sotomayor, the Supreme Court Justice, in the 1980s when she was beginning her 70s when she was beginning her law career. He wrote an outstanding, first it was an article and then it was a book on the case of Puerto Rico and denial of sovereignty and colonialism and citizenship. And I just want to focus here on his phrase, obscuring the colonial relationship between a great metropolitan state and a poor overseas dependency. I want to hold on to that idea, which is no less accurate today than it was in 1978, and unfortunately it's relevant and urgent in new ways now. So I want to take that idea, illuminate the colonial relationship between a great metropolitan state and a poor overseas dependency to help explain, analyze a few of the key developments since the 1970s that have drastically tightened the island's colonial shackles and led pretty directly to the crisis that the island now faces. This is not just a hurricane. I think you all have some awareness of that. So I want to explain really briefly how it's not just a hurricane and how the last 40 years have set up the island to be in a crisis, and then we can talk about it. So I selected a few key dates, a few key things that, even I, some time ago, might have thought it's a little too boring to talk about in a public lecture, but it's essential that we know these things. So In 1976, Congress amended the Internal Revenue Code, tax code, allowing for tax breaks for new U.S. companies in Puerto Rico. This seems like a good thing. It did. It propped up the island's economy. There was a recession all over the place. This was anyway, bad time in many parts of the world. This was the U.S. Congress's way of keeping Puerto Rico afloat, and it worked pretty well for a while. But it did not help with the deep infrastructure that was necessary to avoid the kind of crisis we see now. Meanwhile, not long after that, Congress amended the bankruptcy code. And for reasons that virtually nobody can actually explain, and the congressional record is the record of everything everyone says on the floor of Congress, it's not well recorded there how this decision got made. Puerto Rico was excluded from Chapter 9 bankruptcy restructuring. Chapter 11 is private businesses and individuals. Chapter 9 is municipalities. Every municipality, every local government in the United States is able to engage in some form of debt relief by restructuring its debt through declaring Chapter 9 bankruptcy, except in Puerto Rico. So as municipalities on the island and their public utilities, the electrical company in Puerto Rico, publicly owned, is the sort of most extreme example of a public utility that's in serious trouble. If they had been able to restructure their debt starting in the 80s, we would not be where we are today. And then, in 1996, Clinton, Democrat-dominated Congress, ended the tax credits on the island to be phased out over 10 years. The last tax credits concluded on December 31st, 2005. By 2006, major businesses were leaving the island. So just before the Great Recession of 2007, before the bottom fell out of the housing market, the island was already in deep trouble. 2006. Then the housing crisis happened, which of course affects an island where there's lots of beach property to be gotten rich on. There had been a lot of speculative building, et cetera, so the housing crisis hit there harder than most places. This is just a brief review. In 2014, when the Puerto Rican legislature tried to manage its debt, to restructure its debt, its effort was called the Recovery Act. It got shot down by a U.S. District Court that ruled it unconstitutional. The case was brought by some California investors. The hedge funds won, the island lost. What a surprise. And then in 2016, our Congress passed an emergency measure called the Promesa Act, which is essentially an austerity plan for the island. We'll talk about that in our roundtable here. So I want to just conclude by saying that 100 years or more of governance without representation has led in the last decade to austerity without recourse. That's where we are right now. And Puerto Rico's American citizens lacking effective representation have been unable, once again, to advocate for their own survival. It's not an exaggeration to say that the stakes of justice for Puerto Rico right now are life and death. So I'll leave us with that. Thank you.
Zulma Puerto as our president, right? Whose inauguration was postponed and then canceled because the school year also opened, well, first of all, it opened with Trump declaring to turn around DACA. And we'll leave that to the side, its impact on Latinx students as well. But then Maria happened as well, right? But the big unsustainability for higher education that I'm speaking to as a professor and as a former student who went through higher education are enrollments, okay, declining enrollments. CCSU, of the 17 institutions, you all know this in our system here, We're the only of the four-year universities whose enrollments went up. There's only 2 community colleges whose enrollments increased this past year, and this ain't gonna last very long. What happened in previous years when enrollments, which is the bread of higher education, right, your tuition, the state support's going down here. I was directly influenced by one of those, which is same-sex institutions all of a sudden got smart and started becoming co-ed, right? Another movement, we'll reach out to learning disabled students, right? Another movement, let's reach out to non-traditional age students, right? And then the most recent movement, let's reach out for international, in other words, non-resident alien movements. And it's just looking for wherever those students are. In at least 3 of those categories, people came in great numbers and found the institutions were there to receive their tuition dollars, our tuition dollars, but really didn't have anything in place to deal with the particularities, right? So what about now? Well, what's being looked to, of course, is the great untouched group of people. NPR just announced yesterday, had a great article on the fact that over 50% of Latinx people in the United States, and that this means contemporary as well, have reported that they were not encouraged in their school or family or community settings to consider college or university. Well, guess what? Those colleges and universities want them and want us here. So take a look at the handout that's what we have here. What it shows you is from CCSU, this is from our own website here, where our enrollments are growing. And you can see that minority students in general, overall, graduate and undergraduate, from 2010, when the same stats were being collected up 7 years later, 21% to 33%. And the big bump, okay, is between undergraduate, first-time full-timers, 22% to 37%. And then as you go down and look at what Latinx students, so this is not just Puerto Rican students, but it also, I didn't put in here, that people who identify with 2 or more categories of identity, okay? So you can see here that Latinx students are making the biggest contribution to that increase right there. And that's really important because, Lonnie Guinier, who is a professor at Harvard, has said that this is where the future of the United States lies. She writes, the mission of higher education is to develop a new cohort of potential leaders. It's really important. And she identifies as African American, Black, and some other categories as well. It's important that they be diverse, not just in terms of who can afford SAT prep, but working class and poor, Black and white. Now she leaves out Latinx, but she points out that this mission gets lost in my view here, because the idea is not just to prepare, promote democracy, by preparing workforce-ready people who can help themselves and their individuals and their families here, but also their communities, okay? I wanted to say that CCSU has a really good track record of having stuff in ready. So 1969, when our speaker showed that, remember the Harlem University movement? That's when the EO, Equal Opportunity Program, opened here, literally to help students who were, yep, we got there. So I wanted to say here, who's heading, so graduates of the EOP, and now Wilder Riasco heading that program up right now. Yep, and they've had 30th year reunions, 40th year reunions, and 50th year reunions next year. And when people come back, it is Latinx people saying, this made my life, and then they give back to CCSU in those programs as well. So I just want to hold up some of the names here. We also this year welcomed the Anne Grace Project, which is in part made this through the Airbridge program and other things. And who's running these programs? Wilder Riasco, in honor of Maria Alvarez, Melba Marquez Green, Zulma Toro, right? I mean, these are names that show that this is not reaching down. These are people reaching out from their own experience into the nuanced sustainabilities with resources that will help make it sustainable. So if you're a minority student and you are a person in your family to go to college here, don't look at it as, oh, I'm lucky to get over the edge on him. You're in and you and demand those resources that will, like any other student here, get you to meet the standards and more beyond, including being able to participate in extracurricular activities and internships. Adelante, thanks.
I want to quickly close. I want to make sure that we acknowledge.
Yes, definitely.
Sure. Thanks for the presentation. I just have a quick question. Do we have any Puerto Ricans, any Boricuas in the audience, just to see?
No,
So,
and she just got back from
all
Puerto
right,
Rico.
probably so. this is, I don't know about you guys, but for me, this is like a ay abuela kind of moment. Because, it's like when you go to the, it's like, this grandma stop it. You go to those family reunions and you're the, the grandma goes to you, nena, tú no te has casado, nena, tú no tienes novio. This is how it feels here. No, that's okay because it's sort of eternal. It's oh, here we go. Talk about Puerto Rican again. In Puerto Rico, and you're like, okay, let's do it. So, transport yourself to a situation where the leader of Puerto Rico, for all practical purposes, after a hurricane, okay? So a hurricane hits the island, this nasty hurricane hits the island, and the leader of the island, let's set aside the throwing of paper towels for a moment, says, you can't handle this. You don't know how to do it by yourself, or you expect people to do it for you. So you might think that was Donald Trump, which he did, by the way. But that's what happened in 1898. We got hit by a hurricane, nasty one, and the aftermath of that was, agriculture gets disseminated, and you got the big corporation from the United States taking over the island, just like venture and vulture capitalists are doing now. So it's like, are you kidding me? This is redoing this again from. So yes, we are. Now there's something that Congress and they can do, but there's no incentive there. And economics is all about incentives. So internally, there's before Maria came with the paranda and gave us that tremendo aguinaldo, there were problems inside. There were internal contradictions in the island. Even before the section 936 sort of expired, debt was growing, even in good times. And most of that was for public utilities that do hear, oh, what's going on? And if you're paying attention to News Whitefish and that company that, how could you have that contract for? There's another one now. So there are internal contradictions as how it's managed inside. There are a lot of things that raise eyebrows, like how could you have that? We need to deal with that. If I'm one of those that said not much is going to happen if you solve the status because you don't move forward, you don't move backwards, there's nothing you can do. But there's a lot of stuff that you can do inside in order to try to move forward and then figure it out what we want to do. Post Maria, the best economic term that I can use to describe the situation is it sucks. Let's just put it that way. We're looking at it, you fast forward to 2010, we're going to lose between 10 to 20% of the population. They're going to jump here. And by here I don't mean Connecticut, but it's Florida, okay? And you could go through the conspiracy theory hole and talk about how that was promoted even before Maria for Puerto Ricans to move there and not deal with the crisis that was going on to incentivize migration there and turn but we're not going to go there. So we're thinking 10 to 20% of the population. Between 100 to 200 billion, that's what it'd be, in output, okay? 20% decrease in incomes is gonna be bad. And if we're talking about incentives, people are gonna move, okay? Yes, the tax base is gonna take a hit, obviously, but at the same time, services that are gonna be provided, well, now the demand goes down. So I'm not much for a silver lining, but that's one of the things that you have to tackle first. And I'll leave you with this, stats. Let's just do some facts and figures here. A family of 3 in Puerto Rico, a family of 2, one wage earner, earning minimum wage, okay? This is pre-Maria. Earning minimum wage will bring home $1,100 a month. And you go, well, that sucks. Yeah, I said, but that's a family of 3, one wage earner, 1,100. You take that same family and you take the wage earner and you move them into what we call welfare, at all the magnitudes of welfare, subsidies for housing and all that. That same family will make 1,700. It's 1,100 working for minimum wage, 1,700 if I don't. That right there tells you that the incentives are just wrong. We need to deal with the incentive base that we have, okay? And in order to do that, we need to stop this notion of throwing tax incentives here, because then the big corporations could care less in terms of what I'm gonna pay for taxes. And the hiring and the cost of hiring is so messy that the type of corporations that go there tend to be capital intensive. And by that I mean, they tend to hire less people and more equipment, if you will. Okay, that's why you see a lot of the people being directed to programs in engineering, because that's the type of manufacturing, is high-tech manufacturing. So unless we're willing to come together as a nation and say, look, we have a problem, yes, the status is an issue, but those folks there are not gonna move, there's no incentive for Congress to move. Why would you move if you're a congressman and you know you're gonna lose seats if we move in? It's not like they're gonna add seats to Congress if we become a state. Somebody's gonna be losing a seat. So there's no incentive, so we need to get our act together first and come to the table and say, okay, how are we gonna do this? That needs to be part of the Puerto Rico se levanta. Okay, and with that, I'll take a step back, because otherwise I'll take more time.
Whoever you think makes sense to go based on your remarks.
He can go ahead.
Yeah, all I wanted to point out is, going to what my colleague here said, it's, the need for Puerto Rican people to come together in the island, right? Sort of, so they need to, for the people to come together, right? With the perspective of the future. I mean, so the disaster has devastated everything we had. And so how do we build in the future? It's definitely, we need critical mass, we need to sort of rewrite the whole thing. What we had, either as the structures and the economic structures, the economic barriers that the United States always put, were not, for years now, for 40 years, as other colleagues said, we're creating unsustainable situations. We need to start thinking sustainability, we need to start thinking for the future. And how can we build infrastructures that promote human sustainability, right? Better salaries, better, wealth distribution. The hurricane has demonstrated extremes, pockets of poverty compared to wealth on the island, which we knew, but we like to ignore, right? So the hurricane has kind of, put that out, all the ugliness of extreme poverty, especially in rural areas of the island. We thought it was a lot of urban poverty, but there's a lot of rural poverty in there. And so the hurricane has flushed that out. And so that wasn't working, among the many things. Corruption wasn't working. The, ideological polarization, political fragmentation, social dispersion, and the international isolation, all those things together were already creating an unsustainable situation. Which solution is within, critical mass, people coming together to try to look for a better future. But it's going to be difficult because, again, Puerto Ricans are very fragmented politically. We're very polarized. You think Republicans and Democrats are, at each other's throat here. We are at each other's throat there for years now, right? With the whole question of the status, the damn status, because you don't know what to do. And so, am I saying let that go? It's going to be difficult, but we need to sort of create plans together that include people from all different areas. Cannot be only the educated. It has to be, massive efforts of collaboration to create a future, while at the same time dealing with a Congress and a president and an infrastructure here in the United States that doesn't care, right? We always, in the other conversation we had a couple of weeks ago on the same issue, we had that early distinction of the Foreign Act that Puerto Rico is domestic in a foreign sense, right? So that doesn't make any sense. Sure, it's American Congress. How does it make sense? So we are always considered part, but not really part. And so that has created this 100+ years of insane, doesn't make any sense, never really valuing the Puerto Rican contributions of what Puerto Rico is because it's domestic but in a foreign sense. So whatever that means, exactly, doesn't even mean, it means the mess we have, right? And so we have opened the island for hedge funds and vulture capitalists. Now disaster capitalists, there's whitefishes and other companies that are going to go take advantage of the thing. So the solution is within ourselves, but it's going to be very difficult. And going with what you were saying of the diasporic movements here, the history of the diaspora, is how do we support that, right? Which is frustrating for us here when the hurricane hit. It was frustrating when the whole promesa, because we were here, so what do we do? Well, we're the ones over here voting, we're the ones over here need to politically organize. Because the other side, like as another colleague was saying, they're already politically organizing, right? They already, so Jennifer Gonzalez, the Koch brothers are investing in Florida to receive the Puerto Ricans that are coming in, to make sure that you remember who's helping you now, so you vote. You want to take the state red, we don't want the state to go blue. And so, outside of the state politics is how do we, the ones that are here, press Congress, press the Senate, to sort of try to create solutions or collaborate with whatever Puerto Rican movements happen in the island that are not create more dependency or more vulture capitalism, right? Like that, one of the things that hit me here the most, and all of them are important, is the 2014 issue, right? We say, all right, this is how we're gonna solve our debt, and Congress said, no, I don't like it, or because some hedge fund pig from, sorry for the word, in California said, hey, that's my money, you can't touch my money, and no, right? And so, what do? Beside here, that's what we hear, those that are coming. We need to receive them. The Koch brother already setting up to receive the Puerto Ricans, and we're talking about, they already have people on the ground receiving them at the airport in Florida. People on the ground saying, how you doing? What do you need? Remember, we helped you, so you're gonna vote for Rubio, you make sure of that. And I'm saying, what are we doing? We're not even, they are way ahead of us. And if we don't get those people coming in by the thousands, 70,000 in 5 weeks, they're gonna increase. And get organized politically, right? And say, listen, we are the ones, whatever, you know, the tragic comedy of how Puerto Rican institutions, we're the ones here with congressmen, we're here with senators, right? We have some receptive people here in Connecticut, right, that help out. But there's other states that have family in Utah who are like, what do we do? Well, get on the phone. It's only 3 of you, but, you know, get on the phone and start calling those guys that didn't want to get relief, right? Call them, say, I live here. Make sure that you know that I live here. And I will go to your office and I will set up in there because you're not helping. That's the type of activism that we, the diaspora, need, right? So we protested, and we still have our marginalized and segregated here, which is another one of my concerns, right? Now, as a social worker, they're coming in, and we're going to put them out in the same neighborhoods, the same conditions that we did throughout to marginalize them and segregate them. Here in Connecticut, one of the most segregated states, you know, between urban and suburban. We love to say we're blue, but we are one of the highest segregations between urban and suburban in the state. And when Puerto Ricans are coming, they're going to come to the cities, to Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport. There are cities that are already poor and segregated. That's exactly what they're going to come. Are we going to repeat the same thing? Or are we going to stand up and say, no, this is not going to be allowed? We have to organize, not only to receive them, but then also, these are the only folks that are going to come here and can vote, and pressure that when Puerto Ricans over there maybe come up with some other Puerto Rican solution to the crisis, some congressmen say, no, I don't like that, right? We need to really keep rubbing this colonial, you know, structure and rub it and say, this is what we have, right? You own us, you control us, and yet hedge fund managers and vulture capitalists now do not allow us to rise, right? That's going to be perpetual unless we, so something has to break, right? And it needs a collaborative effort that has worked before. Vieques shows a light, right? When the diaspora was organized and the Puerto Ricans were organized, which under the father of this governor, you know, miraculously, he was, there was a movement, and we stopped the bombing of Vieques. That's not the model, but it's a model of how the diaspora and the island can collaborate. It's going to be hard, it's going to be difficult, but that's the only solution that I can see, that when Puerto Ricans in the island come out with humanistic, socially sustainable solutions for a new future, we don't have people in Washington or hedge fund managers blocking it because it's, hey, that's not against my money interest. Is that I don't care about your money interests, right? We care about the human solution, about the people in the island, or what makes sense, right? So that's what I want to leave with.
Yes.
One of the, and probably this is one of the most concerning is, Chaz, your thoughts on sort of the position of this island in terms of climate change.
All right, so usually I'm the guy that has all the doom and gloom, so thank you guys. So you're hearing the term sustainability, and so I'm going to, I guess, try to cut to the chase as quickly as I can, and hopefully be quicker than everyone else so that everyone ain't sitting here longer. But, so we've been hearing about social constructs and systems and processes and economic systems and processes. And the fact of the matter is that the harsh reality is this. Money is created by humans. So the only thing that's going to do without when money goes, if money goes away, are the humans. Okay? And so humans need the money, although so they think. And the fact is, the money, which is a construct of the social where the humans are, needs the environment, period. Without an earth, there aren't humans, and money doesn't really mean much anyways. And so, just to kind of get to the chase of things here, climate change has been impacting things greatly already on Puerto Rico, right? So I'll go through maybe some numbers here eventually, but the basic realities are this. The oceans are warming in the Caribbean significantly. They have already warmed. So I want to be clear. So when you hear about climate change, you hear about things related to what we know and we have measured and has happened, and then we can construct what we think the future is going to be, possible scenarios. And right now, the oceans have already risen. So for Puerto Rico, the people in Puerto Rico head to the hills. Because guess what? The oceans are rising, the corals are dying, the mosquitoes are coming, and it's not going to stop. Because the reality of it is what they're experiencing on climate change in the Caribbean right now is not what you've put up into the atmosphere. It's not your greenhouse gases that are causing this. It's from 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago. So as harsh as it is on your environment right now, you get to receive a really huge blow. And the best I can try to get you to try to think of maybe what does Puerto Rico have to look forward to on the environmental front is a couple of island nations. Tuvalu. Tuvalu is underwater. The Maldives are going underwater. And so is Puerto Rico. Now, you're fortunate to some extent that you have some hot, somewhat islands, and you can head up. But guess who's going to go up there with you? Who's going to go rising up to the higher elements of the mountains are the mosquitoes and the mosquito-borne pestilence that give disease. So in our American media, you're hearing about the number of deaths that have occurred because of the hurricane. And the number I keep hearing is something usually 48, 49 have died because of the hurricane. But I know for a fact, because I'm in touch with people that look into this and deal with this, that over 1,000 people have died since the hurricane because of waterborne diseases. But we're not hearing about that. So I guess I'll just leave you with this in case people want to ask questions, right? Without the environment, the people don't matter. And without the people, the money doesn't matter.
Yes.
Does anybody have questions? Or we can make this.
In the back?
Dr. Conant, what do you think the environment will look like 40 to 50 years from now to our current greenhouse gas?
For the Puerto Rico in general? Well, let's see. I've been looking that up to get very, very specific, more detail. And so here's some of the state stats that I've learned. It's already warmed since the mid-20th century. The waters have warmed by 2 degrees since 1900. So the ocean waters have already warmed by 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900. And as or maybe we don't, but hurricanes get their strength and their energy and their intensity and their frequency from the warm ocean waters. So here's the interesting thing though. The hurricanes, from personal research, where they're spawning is kind of shifting a little bit out in the Atlantic Basin right now. And so they're spawning and slowly inching their way a little bit more northward, a little bit more westward towards the Caribbean Basin from Africa. And so they are not expected to see more hurricanes. In fact, they're expected to see slightly less total number of hurricanes, but the hurricanes they see are going to be 4s and 5s. Right? If you recall, one of the things when the hurricane that hit Houston, that was really baffling to the scientists, because what happened is it literally went from a category slightly above a 3 to a 5 overnight. Literally overnight. That is not normal by any stretch of the means. Puerto Rico is going to see a lot of that because the waters surrounding it are becoming much, much warmer, much, much faster. The oceans have risen, already risen around Puerto Rico by about 20 inches.
And we don't need, category like 5 to be in 10 years.
No.
You know, the devastation like this one is so bad. The last one before was 1928, right? Almost 89 years. So you need one of those to just impact you for decades.
And that's
to
what
know
I'm getting
what's gonna
at.
happen.
Those are gonna be the normal hurricane for Puerto Rico now.
Let's
It's gonna be
run-
more unlikely to have a hurricane that's not a Cat 4 than it is to have, in the past, one that was a
Or
Cat
2
4.
or 3.
And then you're also really clear, the category 4, category 5 immaterial in terms of impact.
Yeah,
on
so
research and-
it's gotten so intense. In fact, the hurricanes that hit this year were so intense, especially the ones that hit Puerto Rico and Houston and Florida, that there's actually discussion amongst meteorologists and climatologists that perhaps we need to make a category 6.
They will probably leave concrete from the ground. It's not like that. So it's ridiculous, you know.
So, I mean, I hate to be the bearer of even more bad news, but that's what it is.
So I think, yeah, well, we can, you know, obviously, it's a hard thing to be positive about, but the more you know, the more we can try to find solutions, rebuild better, as
Right, and
Foster
so,
was saying. And
yeah, we
yeah.
talk about hurricanes, but also,
No,
like,
what-
in the interior of the island, since 1958, rainfall during heavy storms has increased by 33%. So you're gonna have the shrinking island footprint because the oceans are rising, and on the interior, the rains, we have a new term now that we use in climatology. We call them rain bombs. So overall, over a given year, Puerto Rico is expected to have slightly less rain total. In fact, we're gonna have periods of drought. But when it does rain, it's like a week of rain in one night.
Like monsoons and.
Yeah, and then you're gonna get it all in the highlands, and you're gonna have erosion and flooding, and it's gonna get worse. I mean, I hate to tell you what it is, it's gonna get worse.
That's your memoir, Charles. I hate to tell you, but
And here's the thing I don't hate to tell you is, we've been warned. This is not me telling you, this isn't a new thing today. We've been talking about this for over 100. In fact, 1895, the first guy ever got a Nobel Peace Prize to draw attention to the impacts of CO2 emissions warming the earth was back in 1895. It wasn't Al Gore.
So I'm going to leave everybody wanting more. You see how much there is here to continue to talk about and continue to think about and continue to try to move forward with. I really want to thank Dr. Thomas for coming in and giving us sort of the foundation, and very much thank you to faculty members for taking the time today, and to you here as well for taking your time for this important topic.
and a thank you to Dr. Rodriguez as well for organizing this. This couldn't be more timely. Congratulations.